Everyone, my name is Charles Gauthier, President and CEO of the Downtown Vancouver Business Improvement Association. Welcome to the inaugural session of our new weekly webinar series, DVBIA Members Helping Members. We're so glad you can join us online today. I know for myself, I really missed the face-to-face interaction, and we really felt it was important to do these webinars for our members during this challenging time. Before we jump into our content, I'll quickly walk you through some of the technical aspects of today's digital event. You'll notice that all participants currently have their microphones on mute. We ask that you submit your questions in writing today via the Q&A feature. To access the Q&A feature, you can hover your cursor over the main screen. If you're in full screen mode, you'll see chat, raise hand, and Q&A listed at the bottom of the image. Now, if you're having any challenges with those, just use the chat box and Nicola or Heather on my team will assist you on posting something on the Q&A section. Our presenters will be addressing your submitted questions after their presentation concludes. And now let's get into today's programming. As I said, this is the DVBIA's first ever webinar, and today's topic is presented in partnership with Deloitte. And I can't thank Deloitte enough for stepping up without hesitation when we asked them if they would be willing to help out other DVBIA members on this particular topic. Our kickoff event is called From Crisis to Recovery, Navigating the New Normal with COVID-19. Leading our programming and answering your most pressing questions will be Deloitte Canada's Peter Dent and Christian Kittelson. Peter is Deloitte Canada's managing partner of the BC Region's Financial Advisory. He has over 20 years of experience working with clients in a crisis management capacity, primarily around accountability, transparency, and governance. Christian Kittelson is a partner with Deloitte Canada's Financial Advisory. He is also Deloitte's National Indigenous Practice Leader, as well as the Value Creation Services Lead for BC. And without further delays, I'll hand it over to them now to take us through their presentation. We'll get that presentation on the screen right now. I'll come back in a few more minutes. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Charles. And appreciate the opportunity to present to you and the membership today or this afternoon. And so basically everything that I'm going to talk about today is under the old adage of crisis management, which I've been involved in for a couple of decades now. And that old adage is that no matter how bad things appear to be, don't ever think that they can't be made worse by how one responds to the crisis. And that's doubly true in an issue like we're facing right now around the COVID-19 pandemic, because this is really different than a financial crisis or an cyber event or an integrity event that happens within an organization. This is really akin to a natural disaster, but unlike most natural disasters we come to understand, this is a very, very slow moving natural disaster. And because it is so slow moving, the ground upon which we are standing is always continually being undermined, in that we don't really know exactly when the crisis will end. We don't know how the crisis will end. We don't know exactly what the impact overall of the crisis will be. We just know that every day and every week, what we learn about the crisis and how it impacts our organizations and our businesses evolves. And therefore, we have to respond to that. And so when I talk about crisis management today, I'm going to put it within the framework of our overall methodology and approach, which is readiness, response, recovery, and then thrive. And every business is unique in a situation like this. And so it's hard to say. This crisis has been going on for weeks now, but it's hard to say whether a specific organization is still in the response phase, has moved to start thinking about a recovery phase and an opening up of the economy again, or even is further along and starting to think about how do we thrive in the new normal. And so we're going to focus, though, today specifically around that response recovery phase, with most of that time being spent around recovery. And when I talk about the overall methodology and approach, it's about having a holistic strategy around whichever aspect of the crisis management life cycle you're in. It's having that holistic strategy that takes into account all aspects of your business. And so what does that mean? So what that means is, constantly reframing the crisis. So what you thought was the crisis 3 weeks ago could be very different to what you think or view as the crisis today, and what stage of the crisis you might be in. And in a crisis like this, you may have moved in some stages into a recovery phase, but something happens on a given day and you're back at response. And when I talk about a holistic strategy, irrespective of where you are, every decision that you're making impacts all elements of your business. So for example, I'll just start with an example. So for example, if you're making a human resources or a talent decision, that talent decision could be around laying off staff. And then all of a sudden, you need to be thinking about, okay, so what is the financial consequence of that? Because not necessarily that laying off staff doesn't necessarily remove all of those variable costs. There could be a fixed cost associated with that. You may need legal advice as you work through that process. That has a financial consequence, and therefore it could impact your financial modeling and the scenario planning that you're doing. It could impact your IT as well. And so let's come back to the decision-making process. So our recommendation is always have a centralized decision-making process. And we know there's various organizations on the call today. So when I talk about a centralized decision-making process, if you have two people involved, as few as two people involved in running a business, then you still need to have a centralized decision-making process, because even two people can work counter to each other if they're not communicating and there is no centralized holistic strategy in terms of how the business is responding to the event. So when we talk about this, we sort of look at it in terms of a wheel. And we're talking about, you're looking at sort of that circular talk, about each event. So this could be addressed as a talent event. It could be addressed as an IT issue, a legal issue, a cash flow issue. So it could be something to do with your bank covenants or your financing arrangements or things like that. So all sorts of things are coming into each of these equations. And so you have to take into that account in each stage of this. So what do we know? What is it? And when we frame the crisis around what we do actually know on a given day, because the way in which you're making decisions is based on the best available information in front of you at a given moment. And we understand in this crisis, things change rapidly. So government programs that were available 2 weeks ago, that were not available 2 weeks ago, are now available. So decisions that you made 2 weeks ago could now be impacted and need to be revisited today. Even though you may have thought that you would resolve those issues, it's time maybe to go back and look at those again. And then also looking at what does all of this mean to us? So, okay, this is what we know. Now, holistically, how does that impact the organization and the business and the decisions we're making? So when we're talking about how it impacts, and then again, I go back to my earlier point about having a holistic view of the organization. A talent decision is a legal decision, is an IT decision, is a communications decision, is a stakeholder management decision. And irrespective of the complexity of the organization, all of those play a part or a role in how you're making and working through your crisis decisioning. So for most organizations, I wouldn't say for most, but for many organizations, they have a crisis command structure put in place, what we call a crisis management office. Now you can call it whatever you want, so you have different names for it, but is that sort of that decentralized decision-making process? And again, it could be made up as little as 2 people. Now the other organizations, it has representatives from all aspects of the business. So finance, legal, operations, management are all part of that CMO or that office, and all are coming to the table with their respective viewpoints and looking at each decision that needs to be made through that lens. And then also, you need to have, what is your objective? So what is the objective that you're trying to achieve through the planning that you're going through as part of the crisis response? And so, and the sooner you get to the centralized decision-making process, the sooner you get out of the reactive aspect of the crisis and you move into where you're being strategic rather than just reacting. You're being proactive, then you're being strategic, and that takes you into the recovery and the thrive aspects of the overall crisis response. So, I mean, again, I'll stop there and turn it over to Christian to just take us into a little bit more detail regarding the actual crisis scenario planning around financial modeling.
Great, thanks, Peter, and hello and good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for making the time today, and happy to be here under very unique circumstances. I think what you'll probably hear and what I have to say is very similar in terms of the process that Peter has outlined. There is definitely some immediate and urgent assessments that need to be done from a financial perspective, and on the screen you see a lot of those things. I'm going to kind of talk to you about 4 or 5, 6 different specific items that really fall out of this, and really when we talk about crisis to recovery, there's a point in between that is really about survival. And as a result of running your business, you probably have a number of specific types of routines and cycles that you go through in your business. Under these circumstances, we need to change those a little bit, and we need to think about things on sort of more of an urgent basis. Really, the first thing that you need to think about is cash. And survival is going to be all about cash at the end of the day. And we all know how to forecast our cash. We do our forecasts, we do our cash flow forecasts as a regular operation usually within our finance businesses. But what we're talking about right now is we're talking about very short-term, very specific changes in our cash flow, and understanding, as Peter says, this constant change and rapid change that's occurring under our feet during these crisis moments is really something that we need to inject into our cash flow forecasting. So instead of doing our cash flows for a specific period of time that we're used to, and understanding what our revenues are, understanding what our costs are, understanding the seasonality potentially within our business, now we're really starting to look at things changing on a bi-weekly basis. So that's when we start to think about 2-week cash flow forecasts, and we start to think about 13-week cash flow forecast, which of course is really about a quarter, around a fiscal quarter. As Peter said, and the example that he used, 2 weeks ago, there were certain government programs that did not exist. Now they do exist. Now we can apply for those programs, and you may have the opportunity to utilize and leverage those specific cash flow opportunities that need to be injected into your forecast. So when we think about these things, we need to be looking at those on a very specific 13-week, 2 to 4 week type of cash flow scenarios. Within that, we need to make sure that we're taking a look to eliminate all of that discretionary spend. So when we look at our cash, we're looking at specific variable versus fixed costs. and our variable costs we need to assess in line with our revenue lines, and understand which of those are discretionary and which we can immediately shut down, and understand what the implications of those shutdowns are. I think if survival is at stake, there are no sacred cows, and we need to be very careful about understanding that. The next sort of step that I take is to really have a tight control of that cash, and that's really within that command center that Peter was referring to as well. Depending on the size of your organization, it may not be feasible to have one person who's specifically looking at all cash and expenditure approvals. But the more that you have, the less control that you have over that cash. And if cash is important for the survival over the next 2, 4, 6 weeks to 3 months, then having that central point of expenditure approval is extremely important over the short term. The next area that we really focus on is that stakeholder management. And there's a lot of stakeholders in your business. There's a lot of really important partnerships, collaborators that you have within your business. And it's important that you're having a very open and transparent conversation with those stakeholders. They can be your clients, they can be your lenders, they can be your suppliers. We're all in this together, and people will start to get nervous when there's a lack of information that starts to flow. So our recommendation is making sure that you're communicating on a regular basis and on a real personal basis with all your key stakeholders, because they were your partners coming into this. They're going to be your partners during this, and they're going to be your partners after this. And the type of relationship that you have today is going to have a real definitive type of influence on the type of partnerships that you're going to have after this. The next thing that I would suggest is the funding solutions. Scenario planning, understanding your cash. There's a very important aspect about that, which is your funding solution. So what are your lenders? What are the government programs? What about your opportunities within the facilities that you have? Understanding the implications of using those facilities is very important during this time. And that leads to your contingency planning, your scenario planning, understanding the various types of scenarios that you may be faced with during this period of time. We're typically, in a finance world, we often look at the low, the medium, and the high scenarios. It probably requires us to go quite a bit deeper, understanding the ever-changing world that Peter has acknowledged and has talked about during these types of crises, making sure that we understand what are all those implications and all of those different aspects of change and inputs, economic inputs, both macro and micro, that are going to affect your specific areas, your specific lines of revenue, and the costs associated with those. Finally, the last piece that I'll talk about before we turn it back is the contracts. Understanding the contracts that you have and understanding the legal implications of those contracts that you have with all of your stakeholders is critical in understanding the ramifications of perhaps not meeting those terms on those contracts. So making sure that you have an understanding, a very clear understanding of those implications, critical to ultimately that number one priority, which is cash being king during this survival period over the next few weeks. So I'm going to stop there, said a lot, and pass it back.
I want to thank both of our presenters for that, and we have a lot of time for questions. Just a reminder to post your questions in the Q&A box that's listed below your screen, at the bottom of your screen. And I will look at the questions and ask our presenters to respond to them. So one of the questions I have, on my first question, what was the transition to remote work like for Deloitte?
So thanks, Charles. That's a very good question. We were quite fortunate in that we had about 5 years ago headed down a path of creating greater flexibility in terms of our model, which was our people work their way. So work your way was basically our motto. And that could be working from the office, working from home, working, in whatever venue fits your lifestyle best for you. And it could be where you're breaking up your day as well, where you're working in the morning, taking the afternoon off, and then coming back to work in the evening. It all just depended on what was working best for you. And we also reduced our real estate footprint. So we actually, in terms of the real estate that we have, we do not have workspace in our offices for every staff member that we employ. And we did a study over a number of years to find that many times most of our offices were only occupied about 25% of the time during the day. And therefore, we reduced our footprint around office space available as well. And that required a big investment on our part from a digital capability and the security around remote work. Now, nobody expected that we would be basically emptying our offices all at once and everybody would be having to work remotely. So to say that it was without any pain points would not be accurate. But we were able to, within about a week, transition to a completely remote workplace. Unfortunately, what we were not able to do was get our equipment out to staff as quickly as we would have liked. And so not everybody was able to we weren't able to get monitors out to all of our staff. And so we have our offices filled with monitors, they're not being actually used. So they're just sort of sitting there empty, and we can't get access or now go through a transition where we're doing that. So that it's not without pain, but actually we were surprised at how effective and how these investments we had made over the past 5 years made it a lot less painful exercise than we noticed for others in the market.
Yeah, just to add, I think we were probably a little bit better set up than a lot of companies to be able to respond to this. It's been very interesting to see some of our clients, though, particularly come back to us and our risk assurance group to understand what the cybersecurity aspects of not being in the office are. And some companies have thought ahead on that and are in very good shape. Others are having some challenges for sure. But it's certainly it's certainly a different way of working, that's for sure. And especially when your son decides to take the moment when you're on a WebEx to walk into your office while you're trying to make a presentation.
I'm going to ask kind of a parallel question to the one you just answered before I go to someone that's posted one. How are you able to maintain employee partner morale during this particular phase? I mean, I've been working from home now for 3 weeks, and I miss my colleagues and I miss the face-to-face meetings, and there's a bit of self-care that has to be involved in that and staying connected with my team. But could you comment about that? I mean, you're already practicing working from home to some extent, but I'd be interested for those of us that don't use this model a lot.
Mm-hmm.
Well, you bring up, you raise an excellent point and one of the weaknesses we found was actually with respect to the platform that we were primarily using, which is Skype. And so what you need to do, or what we found we needed to do, was create that face-to-face interaction. So we needed a video conference capability. And what we found was that Skype was not set up to have hundreds of people sharing video, or even dozens of people sharing video all at once. And therefore, it didn't really didn't really help us. But the marketplace also responded very quickly as well, in that other platforms became available for use. And so whether you're using, if it's a, you know, there are the unsecure platforms like House Party, which you can use if it's not a confidential conversation you're having. But what we've done is we've set up programs similar to a virtual happy hour, for example. So we'll get our teams together for a virtual happy hour. We'll get teams together for a virtual coffee. And we'll do that with clients as well, where we'll have virtual coffees, virtual happy hours. It's a little awkward at first to be sitting around sipping a beer together, only doing it remotely. But you know what? It actually, you get used to it. I think as human beings, we actually get used to really dramatic change very quickly. And this is no case in point. I mean, the vast majority of us are practicing the physical distancing protocols very effectively. And we were able to do that very, very rapidly as well. So it just shows you how we can respond and adapt quickly. Christian, anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, in addition to that, certainly there's a difference between the way that the various generations are affected by this as well, and that's something that from a firm like ours, typically the more senior people have been around for decades potentially, and the junior people who are on the same team may have only been with the firm for a couple of years. So they have very different approaches to communication. They have different approaches to collaboration, and that had to be understood. So we've taken time to set up a number of different ways that we can communicate with our staff, with our teams, but we've also had to consider the way that this is a stressful situation for folks as well, and it may not be prevalent or obvious in the beginning, but it does take its toll after a while. I don't know about you folks, but I seem to be spending my life right now in this type of a format. And instead of being face-to-face, where you're taking visual cues from human beings, you're constantly intently listening and trying to visualize what's going on. And I seem to be finding myself by around 3:30 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon being quite a bit more exhausted than I would have been during a normal day in the office. And I think it has something to do with that constant intensity of trying to listen, trying to see you, Charles, and understand whether you're agreeing or not agreeing, and when is my time to sort of speak, because Peter's just finished. And I think that has its toll on folks, and we have to acknowledge that and understand that people may not be able to deal with that all in the same way.
Great answers. We're getting lots of great questions here, so I want to get into some of the other questions, and we have 30 minutes left, so we're going to have plenty of time to get to the 4 that I have now, but hopefully we'll have more. I won't identify the people that are posting the questions, not that there's any reason not to do so, but the first question is, in your experience, those companies that have an emergency contingency plan, have they been able to respond better, faster to the pandemic? That's part 1. I'll wait for the second part after. Peter, I can't hear you.
And there's a construction crew outside my condo here on the West End, and so that is one sector of the economy that continues to work, and they're bashing metal rod pipes against each other. Anyways, so it's an excellent question, and so yes, the short answer is yes. They do recover more quickly. They're able to go into the crisis better prepared. And again, you know, in the world of crisis management, it is not as important in terms of what the triggering event is, and because your response is eerily the same. So whether it's a cyber event, a financial, an integrity event, a financial crisis, a natural disaster, whatever that triggering event is, the response that you go through is eerily the same. Now, there's subject matter expertise that you need for a pandemic that's different from a cyber event, that's different from a financial crisis. But that holistic strategy, that crisis wheel methodology and approach is the same. And how you go through and work through those things, it's still something that's disrupting your business. So your response to that is around the business disruption. So having a plan in place that you had built for, but had done, basically scenario planning around a cyber event or a natural disaster like this one, or whatever the trigger event was, it's the planning process that you're going through that's important. I worked with a special operations, a retired special ops military officer, and what he said really resonated with me. And what he said was his basic lesson of crises were that it's not the plan that's important, because the plan never survives the first encounter with the enemy. It's the planning that's important, because the planning gets the individuals in the organization ready to deal with different situations. It gets them in the right headspace, if you will. And so having that structured plan in place and having gone through the exercise of actually building it makes organizations more resilient in the long run. I'll stop there. Anything to add, Christian?
No, I mean, I would just sort of echo the point of the planning and the communication and the transparency. One thing that when we're looking at this from our firm's perspective internally, constant communication, constant understanding of what's going on. People are nervous enough, and if they don't get information or it doesn't mean that you have to have the answers, but at least acknowledge the questions. If you don't do that, people will start to make up what's in that vacuum, and that can be very dangerous and very destructive for an organization.
So the follow-up, it's actually a question, but I would suggest it's a little bit different. But if you can give 3 tips to small businesses to survive during these times, what would they be?
I'm going to let you go first, Christian.
Sure. Well, it's absolutely reducing your costs as much as you can. So the first thing is any variable cost or any optional cost that you have needs to be eliminated or shut down as quickly as possible. Next thing is, don't only assume that your fixed costs are fixed costs. They don't need to be fixed costs. As you can see with government programs and government policy, they've understood that there's going to need to be some flexibility in those fixed costs. So just because you think that you have a contractual obligation doesn't necessarily mean that that's going to have to be the way that it is. So have those conversations with your lenders. Have the conversation with the folks that hold your debt facilities. And make sure that you're having that conversation about having some deferment or some flexibility with that, because I think that's the key. The third thing that I would say is understand where your revenue lines come from and how they're going to be impacted by a scenario that you just simply don't quite understand right now. Usually we look at our revenue lines and we look at our costs in more of a holistic manner. Right now, we need to be able to cross-reference our specific revenue with our specific costs. If you see that your revenue in this particular area is going to start to drop, then you need to cut out the corresponding costs. So doing that very specific understanding of scenario planning as best you can, even for the very small businesses, is crucial right now.
And Peter?
No, I think that Christian's answered that. And again, I come back to what are the pitfalls? What are the common mistakes that an organization makes in a response to a crisis like this? I've already talked about the centralized decision making. The most common mistake, no matter the size of the organization, is there is no one person in charge. And when I go in and evaluate an organization's crisis response strategy, is first question I ask when I'm interviewing people: on an individual basis is who's in charge. And if I'm getting different answers from each of those individuals, then I know the answer is nobody's in charge. And therefore, what they have or what they think is an effective strategy is not really an effective strategy. The other common mistake that I hear or that I see organizations making is around communication. There's a real resistance to communicate in the absence of knowledge or the best information. And so many times when people say, well, I don't know the answer to something, so I'm not going to say anything. One of the worst things you can do in a crisis situation like this is not say anything. And so it's better to say something, but that could be saying very little. So, but at least you're talking about it. I mean, we're watching it every day on the news where the politicians come out, they have their hour-long updates, but you know what? If you're watching those every day, you're saying, I've learned almost nothing new today. You're basically, it's a soap opera. You could join 3 days from now and you'll have been completely caught up in terms of what those politicians are saying. But what's important for them is to be there answering questions, giving information, irrespective of whether that information is timely, but even saying that you don't know, but it's a good question and you're trying to sort something out. Stay in communication with your people, stay in communication with your suppliers, with your customers, with your stakeholders, your financial stakeholders. If you have a private board or what have you, then those stakeholders as well. But it's very important to communicate and to communicate regularly.
This is a good follow-up question, and I'll leave it up to you. I know that some of our next webinars are going to touch on some legal aspects that might be of interest to our participants. I'll pose a question anyway. Are there any ways to break the commercial lease, as people may find that remote is a good way for long-term, not only temporarily?
Right. And so the first the first answer is, of course, we're neither Christian nor I nor our lawyers, and therefore we're not here to provide legal advice as to whether or not, and we don't have the actual commercial documents in front of us to actually, provide any sort of good feedback. But I can tell you that, look, the way this is going to have a long-term consequence on how businesses operate, and that the amount of bricks and mortar space that many companies have is not going to return to what it was before this pandemic. And that the investments that companies are making in sort of a digital enablement of their businesses is likely going to be fast-tracked for many organizations as well. So that is an excellent question. Many organizations are going to be looking at that and that's a good recovery question as well, because it will aid in the organization's ability to recover and then thrive under the new normal. I don't know, Christian, you got something to add to that?
Well, we're keeping an acute awareness of what's happened in jurisdictions that may be a little bit further through this than we are. And we're starting to see, particularly in Asia, as they start to emerge from this, that their habits are starting to change. We're all aware that the younger generation probably is quite a bit more adept to being able to work digitally or mobilely. Maybe the older generation like us, a little less so. But what's happened as a result of this is it's actually forced the older generation to do what they need to do in order to survive, whether that's be online to purchase consumer goods and groceries, or whether it's to be able to function from a professional standpoint. So it's going to be very interesting to see how that changes once we are through this, because we are going to get through this, and we will see some changes. I think the question specifically, though, I agree. I'm certainly can't give any legal advice, but I do have a number of clients who have had those conversations with their landlords, and my advice is that you can't get anything in the world without asking, and there's nothing wrong with asking and having that conversation, because your landlord is going to need you on the other side of this, and they want to keep that relationship strong. So I would suggest that, again, that communication and that stakeholder management is critical.
And again, I'm reading these questions in the order that they've appeared on my screen. I don't plan to skip over any questions. I may not get to all of them because of our time limitations. I'm going to ask my team, though, maybe to take note of the questions, and if Peter and Christian would like to answer them offline, we
Sure.
can do that. Okay. So the next question is, what is the liability to the employer when the employees are now working at their homes?
That's not a good question. And that is a question for an employment lawyer. And again, it comes into my earlier point about having that holistic strategy. This is not, so when you make a decision that everybody needs to work from home, or then you're making a legal decision as well, and you need to have those inputs around the table. But it's not a question that I can answer.
And I'll just remind our listeners, our participants, that next week we do have an employment lawyer joining us on a webinar. So same time next week, Elizabeth Reed from Boughton Law will be available to answer your questions. The next question is, what are some of your favorite remote tools to use for meetings, digital project management, etc.?
Yeah, so I mean, our three tools that we're using right now are Microsoft Teams, Zoom, and Skype. We found limitations in terms of Skype, the more people are on it. And so Zoom, there are some security concerns around Zoom that everybody's been reading about in the papers. There's been some updates made, but we still, I can only speak for ourselves, for a Deloitte perspective, we don't use Zoom for any confidential client meetings unless we get a consent of the client to actually use that platform. And the other one is Microsoft Teams. So those are the three platforms that we're currently using right now for work. There's other platforms from a more social standpoint, House Party being one of those, but again, that is a personal choice. It's not for our place. It's not a workplace choice.
Christian, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, no, I don't have anything to add to that one. That's what we use.
Okay, so I have I have two questions, and I think we may have time to fit in one or two more depending on the responses. This one has a preamble, which I'd like to read. Our business is based on sending people to work as customer service hosts at sporting events, conventions, meetings. We were extremely active with, for example, 100 staff working at the March Dental Conference in the Vancouver Convention Center, and 180 staff worked at the Rugby Sevens in BC Place, as well as additional staff working at UBC for a concert and in Rogers Arena for the Canucks. All of these jobs are now not possible. We have zero revenue at the moment. We have an office with 4+ years on the lease. We are looking at new opportunities with other industries, but it is difficult to sell in this environment. Our head office in Toronto has now laid off everyone, including my team. I need to find replacement revenue and get our staff back to work. Our company has been in business for 29 years, and we do not want to close. Do you have any ideas for me?
So, in many ways, we're in a similar boat in that our business model is also involves around business development, getting out and meeting our customers, engaging with them at different events. Many cases, you mentioned the Rugby Sevens. Well, there were probably a lot of folks from Deloitte with our clients at that exact same event, and those are all lost to us as well. And the way, and we do have to be innovative. We have to realize that our customers, our clients, are experiencing the exact same issues we are. There's a lack of connectedness in terms of their own business activity. And so we set up a program which we call the virtual coffee. And so what we do is we ask all of our leaders to be reaching out to their clients every day. So we don't make it onerous, but we, anywhere up to 5 clients a day where you're reaching out to, whether through a phone call or an email, and you're inviting them to that virtual coffee. And that is where you can use any of these modems. It's an informal conversation. This is not us trying to get them to do anything, or it's just about to hear what's going on in their lives, and not there to sell them something, or but it's maintaining that client continuity that we want. Those relationships are so important for us because this isn't going to last forever. This is going to go away. we are going to recover from this. I know there's concerns around that we don't know when, but it is going to change. And so therefore you have to come up with innovative strategies that work for your organization to keep connected with your clients. And believe me, what we've found is that our clients look forward to these conversations as much as we do, in that many times their days are just filled up with being on the phone, just reviewing documents and doing it all from home. And there's none of that human interaction anymore.
So that specific example, that is an extremely tough one, and I empathize with the person who asked that question. One thing that I may suggest and will send to you is Deloitte has invested substantially in what we're calling the recovery dashboard. The recovery dashboard looks at a number of different inputs. Typically, when we look at sort of recovery economics, it tends to be looking in the rearview mirror, and it seems that there's a lag between what happened and what you're reporting. The recovery dashboard is actually looking at interesting aspects of health inputs, economic inputs, as well as social and media inputs, puts it all together to develop and estimate an index that shows how there is a negative response to COVID and it starts to become gradually more positive. Our hope is that that's going to indicate when we start to see the change in perception around COVID from the population. And to the person who answered the question, that may be useful to you, because I believe that we're starting to see, and you know, the health numbers are seem to be quite a bit more positive in British Columbia than they are in other jurisdictions. We are coming out of this. When are we going to have the next Rugby Sevens? When are we going to have the next Canucks game? When are we going to have the next event? Not sure, but certainly it's going to happen, and the opportunity is going to be, when is that going to happen, and being prepared for when it does happen, and getting your business back in place, building it up so that you can respond when the time is to press go. And that recovery dashboard may be helpful, Charles. So I'll send the link for that for you members. That's
great. And what we'll do is I'll get to someone on my team to send that to the participants when we're done.
Great.
The next question I have, and I'm looking, we've got about 10 minutes. Again, if someone else has another question, you still have time to post it. But the next one is, I work in urban planning. What would be some of the most important actions from the public sector, or how can we collaborate, to help support recovery of small businesses, i.e. retail and restaurant, in the next 3 months to 2 years?
Yeah. So that's on a lot of people's minds. I mean, the last statistic I saw, it was probably from last week, or the week before, was that they're estimating that that 40% of restaurants, for example, that closed will not reopen. And so because of the impact of this event in the time it's taken. So if we look at what are the fixed costs for these small businesses, you know, there's been a lot of wage programs being put out by the government. So in terms of maintaining some continuity of staff and having it supplemented by a wage program, or keeping on staff that their wages are supplemented if otherwise would have been laid off. But then you get down to what is the other big cost for many small businesses, and that is leases. Those programs, they come down to the provincial and the municipal level as well. So those are things that the public sector will need to look at over the next weeks as this continues to unfold. I don't know, Christian, you want to add to that?
Well, I think the question is quite timely. One of my responsibilities for Deloitte is the financial advisory lead for the BC government account. And I can tell you that the government is trying to figure out what their public policy actions are going to be on the recovery side. We're again looking at some of those jurisdictions that maybe are making their way through this. both in Europe and in Asia, and understanding some of those public policy options. I think, you know, a VAT holiday potentially is a great idea. There's jurisdictions that are looking at providing grants to individuals to be able to spend locally. Maybe there's a PST holiday on certain aspects of the economy and certain sectors that are going to require that supercharge as compared to other sectors. So the good news is that the government of BC is looking at those. I think, as we expected, you know, government's first reaction was to respond to this and make sure that individuals who need the help have money in their pockets to be able to deal with the uncertainty. The next step now is recovery and understanding what are those public economic incentive programs that need to be put in place. And I think some of our suggestions would be absolutely the piece that's missing right now is the grants for small business. You know, I think we've done a lot of things to encourage new debt opportunities for new debt, but that may not be very useful for small businesses. A grant for small businesses would probably be more useful in these types of times, and I think that you know, if I had to predict, I hope that that's where public policy is going to go.
We're getting close to the end of our time, and I think at this point I'd like to just wrap it up. I want to thank Christian and Peter for all of your great content today, all the preparation you put into this, greatly appreciated. Big thank you to Deloitte for stepping up. A while ago I met with the managing partner here, the managing director of Deloitte, Etienne Brusson, and he said they want to give back to the community, and he was quite quick to respond when we presented this opportunity. So thanks again to Deloitte. And also for Christian and Peter, thanks again for fielding those questions from our membership. We truly appreciate your time. And to all our participants today, you'll be receiving a follow-up survey by email this afternoon. We'd like you to take the time and answer those questions. It helps us to improve on these seminars, do things differently if required. We appreciate hearing from you and hope that you'll find a few moments to provide us that feedback and let us know how we did on our first webinar. Also would love to hear from you about other topics that you'd like us to cover in future webinars. And again, we'll host these on a weekly basis every Wednesday at 2 o'clock for at least the foreseeable future. And we hope that you can join us for the next topic, which, as I mentioned before, will be presented by Belton Law, and it will focus on employment issues. So that's our time today. Thanks, everyone. Stay safe and healthy, and hope to see you next week. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you.